Always liked anatomy, ever since I was a little kid, when I first got that little model of the Invisible Man.
I went to the hospital with him, and I didn't know what to do because I thought, do I say, this is Kurt Cobain, take care of him right away, VIP? Or do I say, this is just some guy, don't call the press? I finally went with, this is Kurt Cobain.
3 decades have passed since the world lost Kurt Cobain, the tormented genius whose anguished voice and raw lyrics defined a generation. Yet the shadow of his death still lingers over rock music like a wound that never healed. Now, 30 years after his death, Pat Smear breaks his silence on Kurt Cobain's death. He has offered a rare and deeply personal perspective on the man behind the myth. We will also delve into the many myths and controversies surrounding the whole situation. Let's get started. Kurt Cobain's rise to fame. It all began in the modest, gray-skied logging town of Aberdeen, Washington, where in 1987, Kurt Cobain and bassist Chris Novoselic officially formed the band that would eventually become Nirvana. The two had met several years earlier through their mutual admiration for punk music and the burgeoning underground scene in the Pacific Northwest. They bonded over a shared love of bands like the Melvins, Black Flag, and the Pixies, and they began playing together in makeshift rehearsal spaces around town. After cycling through a series of drummers, the duo settled on the name Nirvana and began performing in local venues. In January 1989, Nirvana released their debut album, Bleach, through Seattle-based independent label Sub Pop. Recorded for just over $600, Bleach was raw and heavy, featuring tracks like Negative Creep and School that showcased Cobain's seething vocal delivery and a sonic aesthetic rooted in grunge. While the album sold only about 40,000 copies during its initial run, it was enough to garner the band a cult following in the underground scene. At this time, Nirvana still lacked stability behind the drum kit. Chad Channing, who played on Bleach, left the band in 1990. It was that same year that Dave Grohl, a 21-year-old drummer from Washington, D.C., who had been performing with the punk band Scream, joined the lineup. Grohl's arrival marked a turning point, as his dynamic drumming brought both power and precision to Nirvana's sound, solidifying the trio's chemistry. The impact of Grohl's addition became apparent with Nirvana's sophomore album, Nevermind, released on September 24, 1991, under DGC Records, a major label under the Geffen umbrella. The album was produced by Butch Vig and recorded primarily at Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California, with a cleaner, more polished production than Bleach. Nevermind blended explosive guitar riffs with catchy hooks and introspective lyrics. Its breakout single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, was released on September 10, 1991, and rapidly gained traction on the radio and MTV. The song's iconic riff, screamed chorus, and anarchic music video catapulted Nirvana into the mainstream almost overnight. By January 1992, Nevermind had dethroned Michael Jackson's Dangerous to reach #1 on the Billboard 200, an unprecedented feat for a band rooted in the underground punk ethos. The album eventually went on to sell over 30 million copies worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time. Other singles from the album, including Come As You Are, Lithium, and In Bloom, further cemented Nirvana's reputation as the voice of a disaffected youth. Critics and fans alike began to view Cobain as the unlikely spokesperson for Generation X. Ironically, he loathed the label. In interviews, Cobain frequently expressed discomfort with fame and resisted the idea of being seen as a generational icon. He maintained that his songs were personal and often misunderstood, and he balked at being cast as a leader or role model. As Nirvana's fame skyrocketed, Cobain's personal struggles intensified. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, which he claimed led him to self-medicate with controlled substances, a habit that would later spiral out of control. Despite his growing disillusionment with the spotlight, Nirvana continued to produce music. In December 1992, the band released Incesticide, a compilation of B-sides, demos, and rarities. Though not a formal studio album, it offered a raw and unfiltered look at the band's evolution, featuring tracks like Sliver, Dive, and a cover of the Vaseline's Molly's Lips. Incesticide reached number 39 on the Billboard 200 and was certified platinum in the United States, reflecting the band's massive appeal. In September 1993, Nirvana released what would become their final studio album, In Utero, produced by Steve Albini. Recorded at Pachyderm Studio in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, the album marked a deliberate departure from the polished sound of Nevermind. Cobain wanted In Utero to reflect a harsher, more abrasive tone, true to his punk roots and emotional state. The lyrics were raw, confrontational, and deeply personal, addressing themes like fame in Serve the Servants, illness in Pennyroyal Tea, and childbirth and loss in Heart-Shaped Box, which was inspired in part by his wife, Courtney Love. Although Albini's original mixes were seen as too rough for commercial release, the final version, after minor tweaks by Scott Litt of R.E.M. fame, retained much of its unfiltered edge. In Utero debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and received critical acclaim for its authenticity and emotional depth. It would go on to sell over 15 million copies worldwide. Despite the band's success, Cobain remained troubled. His relationship with Love, whom he married in February 1992, was often under public scrutiny. The couple's use of controlled substances, the birth of their daughter Frances Bean Cobain, and Cobain's erratic behavior became tabloid fixtures. And then, the worst happened. However, before we go on with that story, we need to clear up some context first. Pat Smear's role in Nirvana. Born Georg Albert Ruthenberg in West Los Angeles, on August 5, 1959, Pat Smear had already established himself in the Los Angeles punk scene long before joining Nirvana. He was a founding member of the Germs, a seminal punk band active in the late 1970s, whose only studio album, G.I., produced by Joan Jett, is widely considered one of the first hardcore punk records. After the Germs disbanded following the death of frontman Darby Crash in 1980, Smear remained active in the underground music circuit, performing with bands such as 45 Grave and Twisted Roots, and briefly touring with death rock pioneers Christian Death. Smear officially joined Nirvana in September 1993 as a second guitarist to support the band during their tour in promotion of In Utero, their third and final studio album released that same month. His recruitment marked the first time Nirvana added a fourth member for live performances. The decision was largely driven by Kurt Cobain's desire to strengthen the band's live sound, allowing him to focus more on vocals and improvisation. Smear's punk background and minimalist playing style complemented Nirvana's aesthetic, and he quickly proved to be a reliable and unpretentious addition to the group. His first show with Nirvana was on September 25, 1993, at the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago, kicking off a series of live dates across the United States and Europe. One of Pat Smear's most notable appearances with Nirvana was during their MTV Unplugged in New York session, recorded on November 18, 1993, at Sony Music Studios in Manhattan. The performance was unique not only for its stripped-down acoustic arrangements, but also for its emotionally vulnerable setlist, which deviated from the typical MTV Unplugged formula. Instead of performing a greatest hits style set, Nirvana, with Smear and cellist Laurie Goldston, chose lesser-known originals and covers, including songs by Lead Belly, David Bowie, the Meat Puppets, and the Vaselines. The performance was broadcast on December 14, 1993, and later released as a live album on November 1, 1994, 7 months after Cobain's death. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and has since been certified 5 times platinum in the US by the REAA. Beyond the unplugged performance, Pat Smear also played a key role in Nirvana's final electric shows. One of these was the Live and Loud concert, recorded at Pier 48 in Seattle on December 13, 1993, for MTV. This high-energy performance featured a full set of in utero tracks, fan favorites, and visual elements like on-stage mannequins and a wall of flowers, symbolizing the band's aversion to mainstream aesthetics. Smear's stage presence in Live and Loud was particularly notable. Clad in his trademark floral shirts and oversized cardigans, he moved with relaxed confidence, grounding the band's often chaotic energy. Though not featured in studio albums, Smear's live work was eventually compiled in From the Muddy Banks of the Wishkah, a posthumous live album released in October 1996. The album peaked at #1 on the Billboard 200, and included several performances from the In Utero tour era, some of which featured Smear, although not all performances explicitly credited individual members. Smear's time with Nirvana coincided with a period of both creative output and personal turmoil within the band. As Cobain's health deteriorated and his use of controlled substances intensified, tensions rose behind the scenes. Nevertheless, Smear remained a calming presence. According to Dave Grohl in various interviews, Smear was not only an excellent musician, but also provided much-needed levity during stressful times. Despite being the newest member, Smear developed a rapport with Cobain and Novoselic quickly. His role was strictly as a live guitarist. He did not appear on In Utero, and there is no evidence that he was ever formally considered a full member in studio contexts. Still, his involvement during the final 6 months of Nirvana's existence placed him in the middle of historic and deeply emotional moments. Pat Smear was present during Nirvana's last concert, which took place on March 1, 1994, at Terminal 1 in Munich, Germany. The show was part of the European leg of the In Utero tour and turned out to be anticlimactic due to technical difficulties and Cobain's worsening health. Cobain was suffering from bronchitis and laryngitis during the performance, which led to the cancellation of the remaining tour dates. Just days later, everything fell apart. Kurt Cobain's death. Kurt Cobain, frontman of Nirvana and one of the most influential musicians of the 1990s, unalived himself on April 5, 1994, in his home at 171 Lake Washington Boulevard East, in the Denny Blaine neighborhood of Seattle, Washington. His body was discovered 3 days later, on April 8th, by electrician Gary Smith, who had arrived to install a security system and noticed Cobain's body through a window in the greenhouse above the garage. He had perished from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, and toxicology reports later confirmed the presence of a high concentration of controlled substances and traces of diazepam or Valium in his bloodstream. A final note addressed to his wife, Courtney Love, and their infant daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was found nearby, as well as a Remington Model 11 20-gauge shotgun, which Cobain had purchased through a friend named Dylan Carlson. Cobain's death followed years of increasingly visible personal struggles, both physically and emotionally. He had long suffered from chronic stomach pain, diagnosed by some as irritable bowel syndrome or a stomach ulcer, though never clearly defined, which he described as unbearable and a significant contributing factor to his use of controlled substances. In multiple interviews, including with Rolling Stone and Melody Maker, Cobain stated that controlled substances provided the only consistent relief from his physical agony. By the early 1990s, his addiction had become severe and well-known. Friends, family, and bandmates had repeatedly urged him to seek treatment, and although he attempted rehab on several occasions, including stints at Los Angeles' Exodus Recovery Center and the Hazelden Foundation in Minnesota, the efforts were short-lived. One of the most alarming warning signs came on March 4, 1994, when Cobain was hospitalized in Rome, Italy. Nirvana was in the midst of their European tour promoting In Utero, and Cobain had flown to Rome to meet his wife. At the Excelsior Hotel, he ingested a large quantity of Rohypnol, a benzodiazepine, mixed with champagne. He was rushed to Umberto Frere's Polyclinic Hospital and remained in a coma for roughly 20 hours. Initially reported as an accident, Courtney Love later revealed that this had been an attempt to unalive himself, as Cobain had left a note behind that she discovered afterward. He was released from the hospital 5 days later and returned to Seattle, but his condition remained precarious. Friends and family noted that his demeanor had shifted. He was more withdrawn, unpredictable, and seemed burdened by a profound emotional exhaustion. Cobain's mental health had long been a concern. Diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, as a child, and exhibiting symptoms of depression as a teenager, he struggled with feelings of isolation and despair throughout his life. These issues were reflected in his lyrics, interviews, and journals, many of which described a deep sense of alienation and a resentment toward fame and the expectations placed upon him. Despite the commercial success of Nevermind and In Utero, which sold over 30 and 15 million copies, respectively, worldwide, Cobain was deeply uncomfortable with his celebrity status. He resented being seen as the voice of Generation X and felt that his music was being commodified in ways that stripped it of authenticity. On March 18, 1994, a domestic disturbance at his Seattle home led to police being called. Courtney Love had told authorities that Cobain had locked himself in a room with a gun. Police confiscated several firearms from the property, and although Cobain denied intending to harm himself, the incident heightened concerns among friends and family. Just weeks later, on March 25th, Love staged an intervention at their home, attended by several close friends, bandmate Krist Novoselic, and Nirvana's manager Danny Goldberg. Though initially angry and defensive, Cobain eventually agreed to enter rehab and checked into the Exodus Recovery Center in Marina del Rey, California, on March 30th. However, he left the facility the next day without informing staff and flew back to Seattle. Over the next several days, his whereabouts were largely unknown, even to those closest to him. There were several reported sightings of Cobain around Seattle. He was seen by a few people, including a taxi driver and a fan who claimed to have spoken with him at a local park. Courtney Love hired private investigators to locate him and filed a missing person report under his mother's name, Wendy O'Connor, to protect his privacy. Meanwhile, Cobain had returned to his Lake Washington home and secluded himself in the greenhouse above the garage. It was there, at some point on April 5th, that he unalived himself. The medical examiner determined the official cause of death to be a contact perforating shotgun wound to the head. The final note found at the scene was written in red ink and referenced Cobain's disillusionment with fame and music. It opened with an address to Cobain's imaginary childhood friend, Boda, and expressed his internal conflict over continuing to perform. Cobain lamented that he no longer felt excitement when listening to or playing music, stating that it isn't fun anymore. He also referenced Neil Young's lyric, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," a line from the 1979 song My Hey Hey, which many have interpreted as a grim summation of Cobain's mindset. The note ended with a direct message to Courtney and Francis, expressing his love and urging them to go on without him. Cobain's death shook the music world and led to an outpouring of grief from fans and fellow musicians. On April 10, 1994, a public memorial was held at Seattle Center's Flag Pavilion, attended by over 7,000 fans. Courtney Love read from the final note, and Krist Novoselic addressed the crowd in an emotional statement. That same month, Nirvana's MTV Unplugged in New York episode saw a surge in airings and posthumous appreciation, later becoming one of the best-selling live albums of all time. Cobain's death at age 27 placed him in the infamous 27 Club, a group of musicians who died at that age, including Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison. His passing marked the end of Nirvana and symbolized the fading of the grunge era's peak. Though he died young, Cobain's influence has endured. His music continues to be celebrated for its honesty, vulnerability, and raw energy, and his personal writings, published posthumously in journals, offer further insight into his troubled mind. Years later, we have more perspective on the whole thing. Pat Smear's Reflections, 30 years later. In recent years, Pat Smear has finally offered candid interviews about the profound emotional impact of Kurt Cobain's death in April 1994. Speaking with outlets such as Alternative Nation and Grunge.com, Smear admitted that the experience was deeply traumatic and that its effects lasted far beyond those tumultuous months. Smear even after all these years, has been unable to forget a deeply personal moment in this whole saga, missing what would be Cobain's final attempt to reach out. In an emotional recollection shared with Rolling Stone and later detailed in Far Out magazine, Smear revealed that in the days leading up to Cobain's death in early April 1994, Cobain had called him. Smear wasn't home at the time, and the message went unheard until it was too late. That missed connection, what could have been a last conversation, perhaps even a cry for help, is something Smear has said he regrets to this day. The call came just after a turbulent and fragile period for Cobain. As noted earlier, on March 4, 1994, he was hospitalized in Rome. Pat Smear was among the close friends who flew to Rome after the incident, reportedly helping facilitate Cobain's care at the Umberto Polyclinic and staying by his side during the recovery. At the time, Smear believed Cobain would pull through. Despite his well-known struggles with addiction, chronic stomach pain, and depression, he was still actively working and had even discussed future plans. But the relief was short-lived. On the 1st of April 1994, just days before his death, Cobain escaped from the Exodus Recovery Center in Marina del Rey, California, where he had checked in for rehab. He flew back to Seattle and, over the next few days, went largely off the grid. It was during this period that he attempted to call Pat Smear. But, alas, he was not at home when the call came through. He later discovered a message had been left, but by then, it was too late. Kurt Cobain was found dead on April 8, 1994, at his home in Seattle, though the medical examiner placed the actual date of death at April 5th. Smear has since spoken openly about the emotional impact of that missed call. In interviews, he's described the profound guilt and grief that followed, emphasizing how he would have done anything to be there for Cobain in that moment. "Whatever help he needed from me, I couldn't give it," Smear once said, reflecting on the finality of that unreturned message. It wasn't just the loss of a bandmate, it was the loss of a friend who may have been reaching out one last time in a moment of despair. This haunting memory followed Smear into his post-Nirvana career. When he joined Foo Fighters shortly afterward, he described the early tours as emotionally difficult, weighed down by unresolved grief, even though the Foo Fighters' emergence marked a path forward after Nirvana. That one moment, a missed call and an unheard message, has remained etched in his memory, a poignant reminder of how quickly things can slip away and how the smallest missed connection can leave a lifelong scar. While Dave Grohl's insistence on moving forward provided some clarity, Smear admits that stepping onto stage at Foo's first gigs was emotionally too soon. He told Alternative Nation in February 2021, "Touring with Foo in 1995 was maybe a little soon for me. I was still pretty traumatized by the whole ordeal." Music journalist Brett Buchanan recounted Smear's memory of Foo Fighters' first show in Arcata, California, where he spray-painted thrift store tees to sell his band merch, hoping to recover a sense of normalcy and control amid grief. Though these small creative acts may suggest resilience, they also underline how raw those early months felt for Smear. Grief seeped into every chord and gig. In discussing Cobain's talent, Smear consistently balances reverence with sorrow. He often credits Kurt's musical genius, yet underscores that he never fully understood the pressures his friend endured privately. In interviews following the 20th anniversary of In Utero, he recalled how Cobain's artistic brilliance was shadowed by intense personal suffering, health issues, addiction to controlled substances, and an unbearable relationship with fame. Dave Grohl, in Reflections on that Era, has described Smear's presence in Nirvana as deeply uplifting, bringing laughter back into a band that Cobain felt was fading into despair. Yet Smear's own view is nuanced. Though he brought stability and friendship, he also empathized with Cobain's deep-seated pain. For Smear, remembering Cobain now is an act of both celebration and mourning, a way of recognizing genius while acknowledging the burdens it carried. In a Grunge.com interview, Smear described being so unsettled by Cobain's passing that he felt disconnected from reality. "The days after the death felt like I was living in a surreal fog. he said, and he avoided engaging with media or revisiting historic Nirvana footage. It wasn't until Dave Grohl invited him to join Foo Fighters later in 1994 that Smear slowly began to step out of that fog. The offer, he says, pulled me back in. Still, the transition wasn't easy. Smear left Foo Fighters in 1997 due to exhaustion, though he returned in 2006 and again as a full-time member in 2010. His early departure, some observers say, reflects the emotional intensity he brought with him. He was a rock veteran, reeling from a tragic loss. Even as the Foo Fighters gained success, Smear continued to carry Cobain's memory and unresolved feelings with him, weaving them into his journey as a musician and friend. Smear frequently expresses awe at Kurt's songwriting, raw vocal delivery, and ability to channel generational frustration. Yet each expression of admiration is folded into a statement about the private anguish Cobain suffered. That tension between brilliance and suffering is central to Smear's perspective. Despite Cobain's immense talent, the pain he endured was immense and isolating. This duality continues to shape how Smear remembers him. As the 30th anniversary of Cobain's death approaches, Smear's reflections gain even greater weight. In interviews marking 3 decades since April 5, 1994, he has described sharing in quiet remembrance with Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl, acknowledging they are older now, but that Cobain's absence remains acute. For Smear, those remembrances serve a dual purpose. They are both an emotional reckoning with trauma and a tribute to Cobain's soaring artistry. Now, in 2025, his decision to speak publicly, after decades of silence, is as much a gesture of closure as it is a reminder that grief can persist for a lifetime. His words now offer fans a fresh window into the final chapter of Nirvana and the human cost behind the rock legend. Smear does not glamorize the tragedy. Instead, he insists on honesty. He was brilliant, tortured, and desperately alone, Smear has said, and that memory is something I carry still. In this way, Pat Smear's reflections humanize Kurt Cobain. Controversies surrounding Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. In the years after Kurt Cobain's death, numerous conspiracy theories emerged, challenging the official determination that he died by self-unaliving. Prominent among these are Who Killed Kurt Cobain and Love and Death, The Killing of Kurt Cobain by Ian Halperin and Max Wallace, which argue that Cobain may have been killed under the orchestration of his wife, Courtney Love. These theories heavily reference claims made by private investigator Tom Grant, who was initially hired by Love to locate Cobain after he left rehab. Grant's suspicions are fueled by purported anomalies: a shotgun found without identifiable fingerprints, questions over the handwriting in the final note, and the unusually high concentration of controlled substances in Cobain's system, which some argue would have incapacitated him before he could pull the trigger. Grant's involvement gained wider attention through the 2015 documentary Soaked in Bleach, which dramatizes his claims, including recorded conversations with Love and Cobain's attorney Rosemary Carroll. In the footage, Carroll reportedly voices suspicion about the bottom portion of Cobain's note, suggesting it was forged or traced. The documentary also draws attention to interviews in which Love supports theories that Cobain was seeking to divorce her just before his death. Intriguingly, family members such as Courtney Love's father, Hank Harrison, and Cobain's grandfather, Leland Cobain, also publicly questioned the official ruling on the cause of death. Some allege that after Cobain's death, his credit card was used despite being cancelled. Grant points to this as suspicious. Despite these allegations, key authorities affirm the official verdict. The Seattle Police Department, forensic linguists, and Nirvana's former management have repeatedly upheld the official findings. In 2014, SPD Detective Mike Siasinski reviewed the case and stated he found evidence that strengthened the self-unaliving conclusion. Forensic linguist Carol Chasky ran Cobain's final note through Snare software and concluded it was consistent with a genuine note, finding no evidence of forgery. Meanwhile, SPD Sergeant Donald Cameron dismissed Grant's theories as having no shred of proof. Critics of the death theories argue they reflect a kind of misogynistic scapegoating known as the Yoko syndrome, where female partners of male rock icons are unfairly blamed for their downfall. Salon specifically criticized the theories surrounding Courtney Love as part of this trend. But wait, that's not all. Inside the band, internal tensions also played a significant role in the lead-up to Cobain's death. By the end of 1993 and into early 1994, Cobain was struggling with severe chronic stomach pain, which contributed to escalating addiction to controlled substances. These personal and health issues manifested in erratic behavior, including the widely reported March 1994 police intervention at his Seattle home after Courtney Love expressed concern about his well-being. This emotional turmoil strained the relationships within Nirvana, with Cobain feeling increasingly alienated from his bandmates and weighed down by his public image. Following Cobain's death, legal battles over Nirvana's unreleased materials added another layer of controversy. The final studio track he recorded, You Know You're Right, became the center of a fierce dispute between Courtney Love and surviving band members Dave Grohl and Krist Novoselic. Love opposed its release on a multi-disc box set, favoring a single-disc compilation, and filed a lawsuit in 2001. The dispute was resolved in September 2002, paving the way for the track's premiere on the self-titled Greatest Hits album, Nirvana, which was released on October 29, 2002. The song subsequently reached #1 on both Billboard's mainstream rock and modern rock charts. Love earned approximately $4 million from the settlement and later sold a 25% stake in the Nirvana catalog, valued at around $50 million. Despite the controversy and tragedy, Nirvana's legacy remains profound. The band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014, solidifying their influence on grunge, punk, and alternative rock music. Cobain, beyond his musical achievements, has become a symbol for mental health awareness, his candidness about depression and addiction inspiring deeper cultural discussions. Pat Smear, who toured with Nirvana during its final year, continues to keep Cobain's spirit alive through his ongoing work with Foo Fighters, preserving the emotional honesty that was central to Nirvana's identity. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.